As a British citizen and offspring of a middle-class Antipodean family, the death of Queen Elizabeth II this past September saddens me. Not in the fashion that was promoted by the establishment media, but in much the same way as the passing of any especially venerated luminary might. The closest example for me in recent times, while imperfect and slightly disrespectful, is probably the death of David Bowie, a constant cultural presence in my life, beloved of childhood memory, respected, admired, and always there. The Queen occupied a similar place in my heart, albeit far more imposing. I was never a full-blown monarchist, save for an intense bout of patriotism around the time I got my UK passport at the age of 9, and indeed became less so the older I got, but I always revered the institution and what it ostensibly represented. My sense of love and loyalty for Her Majesty can best be summed up in the words of my mother, who wrote this to me on the day of the Queen's death. I never called myself a royalist, but she embodied much of what I think you and our family respect and honour. I was a preschooler when she was crowned, and my aunts were in London at the time of the coronation and sent me a souvenir. To be honest, I can't remember what it was. However, she seems to me to have been a decent, stable and sensible woman, and I just wanted to acknowledge these past 70 years as having been important, even if they are the last sigh of that good sense and decency that we revere. Mum is on the money here. Queen Elizabeth appears to have been a decent and sensible woman, and as such, we of the British Commonwealth, and indeed the world at large, were privileged to have had a figurehead of such good character whom we could look up to. Perhaps the most pertinent example of Her Majesty's good sense can be found in her first televised Christmas message, in which she said,
"That it's possible for some of you to see me today is just another example of the speed at which things are changing all around us. Because of these changes, I'm not surprised that many people feel lost and unable to decide what to hold on to and what to discard, how to take advantage of the new life without losing the best of the old. But it's not the new inventions which are the difficulty. The trouble is caused by unthinking people who carelessly throw away ageless ideals as if they were old and outworn machinery. They would have religion thrown aside, morality in personal and public life made meaningless, honesty counted as foolishness, and self-interest set up in place of self-restraint. At this critical moment in our history, we will certainly lose the trust and respect of the world if we just abandon those fundamental principles which guided the men and women who built the greatness of this country and Commonwealth. Today, we need a special kind of courage, not the kind needed in battle, but a kind which makes us stand up for everything that we know is right, everything that is true and honest. We need the kind of courage that can withstand the subtle corruption of the cynics, so that we can show the world that we are not afraid of the future.
Although these words were spoken in 1957, they are just as apt today, 65 years on, even more so in fact. The symptoms of social decay that the Queen spoke of on that long ago Christmas afternoon are flourishing in 2022. We have thrown aside religion in favour of the science, whereby truth is no longer to be found within ourselves, by taking an honest inventory of our souls, confronting our myriad sin, and repenting before a divine morality that no human can tinker with, but in blind adherence to whatever officialdom tells us on behalf of their sponsors at BlackRock, Vanguard, Pfizer, and GlaxoSmithKline. We have abandoned morality in personal and public life in favour of clicks, likes, and shares. The honest are now counted as fools, or to use the current parlance, conspiracy theorists and far-right extremists. And self-interest is set up in place of self-restraint, as instant gratification is deified through social media, hookup culture, the incentivization of criminality, the glorification of debauchery, and digital prostitution through mediums like OnlyFans. The Queen's warnings to us were indeed the words of a wise and prescient woman, but it would seem that they fell entirely on deaf ears. For who could play this speech back in 2022 and then look around and say, well, we really nipped that in the bud, didn't we? No. Sadly, these evils have all come to pass. These and many more. So while I acknowledge Her Majesty's foresight and lament her passing, it is incumbent upon me, as a critical thinker, to ask exactly what it is we are supposed to have lost here. Many will argue, as my mother implied in her email to me, that it's what the Queen represented that's important, that her role was never one of action and executive function, but rather to inspire and guide. I get this, in principle. But I also take exception to the idea that she has kept us honest and decent, or that she has in any way held back the tide of smut, degeneracy, corruption, and outright criminality that has engulfed our institutions and our culture. Because the fact of the matter is that under her reign, British society slid from decency into disrepair, into decadence, and from thence into downright depravity, and this process has been mirrored throughout the West. To name just the marquee disgraces that have befallen Britain on her watch: the importation of millions of economic migrants from the Third World since the late 90s has been a net negative for the UK. Tony Blair's mendacious and entirely unnecessary globalist policy, since maintained and accelerated by every subsequent government, has not only changed the character of the country forever, but brutalised it in a way that would have been unimaginable to Her Majesty on that winter's afternoon at Sandringham in 1957. Taken alone, the colossal ignominy of the Muslim grooming gang scandal that has seen tens of thousands of British girls raped and tortured in the past few decades is enough to condemn Britain's disastrous immigration policies across the board. But the issues go much deeper. From the Manchester Arena bombing and countless other terrorist attacks, to London's knife crime epidemic, to the crumbling NHS, the list goes on and on. And still the boatloads are arriving. Anyone who would scoff or bristle at this claim ought to read Douglas Murray's The Strange Death of Europe. The wokeification of Britain's institutions has been an astounding clown show to behold. One that would be funny were it not so galling. From the police force to the military, from Parliament to the post office, everything is now LGBTQIA+, with the rank pageantry of the whole thing literally resembling Berlin in the 1930s. This new religion of sexual deviancy has not only replaced Britishness as the nation's chief virtue, but has been weaponised by the state against its people, with the classification of anything even mildly critical of the rainbow cult as hate speech, and thus punishable by criminal penalties, for which many have already been arrested and persecuted. One such example was recently captured by actor and activist Lawrence Fox of the Reclaim Party, in which a distinguished army veteran was arrested for causing anxiety to a member of the LGBTQIA+ community for retweeting this image originally posted by Fox. I've linked footage of the arrest and Fox's subsequent remarks in the description. The madness is very real, and it has infected Britain from top to bottom. But it doesn't stop with rainbow flags and child sex change operations. The regressive scourge of critical race theory is being taught and mandated in schools, public institutions, and private companies, as it is in the United States. Attacks on whiteness are now acceptable, and indeed encouraged in the UK, with organisations such as the BBC and the RAF now openly discriminating against white people in their recruitment practices. Perhaps the most egregious example of Britain's descent into dogmatic authoritarian dystopia, however, is the fervent adoption of lockdowns, vaccine mandates, and other tyrannical measures during the COVID crisis. This facet of recent mass hysteria is not unique to the UK, but in no place other than perhaps Australia, New Zealand and Canada was it as enthusiastically and fanatically rolled out as in England's green and pleasant land. Elizabeth herself was made a sad and pathetic victim of this lunacy at her own husband's funeral, poignantly immortalised in this image, which may well be the most telling symbol of her complete impotency in the face of this wave of filth that has swamped our once proud and obstinate people. All of this and more has happened on her watch, so I ask again, what is it that we are mourning here? If it is simply the passing of a decent, stable and sensible woman, for whom many of us feel a nostalgic, familial kind of affection, then I can get on board with that. But if, as the mainstream news and many independent voices also were suggesting for a solid month or more following the Queen's death, that we're supposed to be mourning the loss of a courageous and upright figurehead who stayed the hands of the unthinking people who would carelessly throw away ageless ideals, to use the Queen's own words, then I'm not having a bar of it. Her Majesty certainly could talk the talk, and she did it with a grace and composure that may never be matched. But in terms of preventing the degeneration and destruction of our society, she accomplished not a thing. You may recall, as I do, the wall-to-wall TV coverage lamenting Her Majesty's passing and celebrating her great and noble legacy. It moved me at times, but I refused to partake in the pageant of idolatry. Instead, I wrote back to my mother. In the last year or so, I've given up the last of my monarchist sympathies, and must shrug this passing off as I would any other lofty elite who has failed the people she was supposed to represent. The time for fluffy sentimentality over our so-called leaders is gone, and the time for straight talk and real change is here. I'd love to live in the past and pretend the royals were all I imagined them to be as a child, but it simply isn't the case. And despite the decency and steadfastness Elizabeth represented, she has presided over the near total destruction of my homeland and done absolutely nothing to prevent it. And the best I can summon for such a monarch is a paltry kind of pity. I feel kind of bad about that last part. It's not only pity that I feel. I did love Her Majesty, still do, and despite my now avowed Republican leanings, she will always be my sovereign. But she was the last. From here, I completely decouple myself from the monarchy and condemn at the outset King Charles III and his treacherous ties to the World Economic Forum and Klaus Schwab, to say nothing of Andrew and his close friendship with pedophile and child sex trafficker Jeffrey Epstein. I think my mum has it right. These past 70 years were important, but they are indeed the last sigh of that good sense and decency that we revere. And while Elizabeth was powerless against the forces of evil that now beset us, at least she represented a higher ideal. The same cannot be said for her sons. The sad fact remains, though, that she did fail us. We needed more from her. We needed more than speeches and symbolism. We needed a special kind of courage, not the kind needed in battle, but a kind which makes us stand up for everything that we know is right, everything that is true and honest. We need the kind of courage that can withstand the subtle corruption of the cynics, so that we can show the world that we are not afraid of the future. Thanks for listening. Please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future videos. Please also subscribe to my Substack at jjdawson.substack.com. And if you'd like to keep in touch, please do follow me on Twitter at RealJJDawson. You can also follow me on Getter, Gab and Minds. And of course, if you enjoyed this, please do give it a like and share it about, because it really helps me out.